And I decided that the only thing I could do to please God and myself was to take me out of this world. It took me a long time and a lot of planning, and what I did was I went and got a gun. I happened to be what they call a gun nut. I know all there is to know about a lot of firearms. And I picked the one that I knew would do the most damage. It's a 9mm Browning automatic that I put to my head, knowing full well that if I squeezed that trigger just right, I might get 2 rounds off, because I didn't want to be a vegetable. I'd worked in emergency rooms and I'd seen people who messed up suicide and were vegetables, and I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be a burden anymore. So I put the clip in the gun, I cocked around into the chamber, I put the gun up to my head and I pulled the trigger, and it clicked. It didn't go off. I didn't die. And I felt like I had failed at one more thing. I couldn't live and I couldn't die.
This is The Bottom Line. I'm Gary Thiemann in Los Angeles. The throes of alcoholism leads only to incomprehensible demoralization. But where does it all start? What kind of person can become an alcoholic? Don't you have to be on Skid Row? Homeless? Stereotypes of alcoholics are often misleading. Just ask Skip, an ordained minister.
My name is Skip, and I'm an alcoholic. I was born in West Hollywood, California. I was the son of a machinist and a hard-working housewife. My drinking career began when I was about 13 years old. We used to steal my dad's wine out from under the counter and replace it with water. I drank from the time I was 13 alcoholically. It seemed like the alcohol made me fit when I couldn't fit any other time. I felt like an outsider. I felt like I didn't even belong in my own skin. As a result of drinking, though, I felt like I belonged. I felt like I was a part of. I could fit in with anybody as long as I had enough alcohol or drugs in my system. I remember drinking on my 21st birthday. That's supposed to be a celebration, and you're supposed to go out and get drunk when you're 21, especially if you live in the Hollywood area. And that's what I did. I went out and got drunk. It took me all of 2 hours to get so drunk that I threw up for 3 hours and went out and did it some more. My first marriage ended as a result of my alcoholism. My ex couldn't stand to have me around because all I ever did was scream and holler and throw things. I had been a church-going kid when I was growing up. My father insisted that we all go to church every Sunday. We went to Sunday school every Sunday. As I got older and discovered that there really was a God, I thought he was a vengeful God. But that was okay because he was in charge. I remember when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I was in a small church group and really enjoyed being in it. But every time something would happen, I would go home and get drunk. If it was a happy occasion, I'd go home and celebrate. If it was an unhappy occasion, I'd go home and just get drunk. I was a molestation and physical abuse victim from the time I was 7 until I was about 17 years old. I was abused by a good family friend that we called Uncle. I think part of the reason that I drank and used was because it covered up the shame and the guilt of being molested and being physically abused. At 17 years old, I left home, and I'd had enough. And I took off for the streets of Hollywood because, see, I knew I could survive on the streets of Hollywood. I was one of the runaway kids that lived in abandoned buildings and panhandled on the streets, and when that wasn't good enough and when there wasn't enough money to eat doing that, well, I sold my body to anybody who'd buy it. Because that's what I knew. That's what I knew is love. From 17 to about 19, I lived on the streets of Hollywood. I drank and I used every single day. I don't know that I ever drew a sober breath in all that time. At 19 years old, I thought I should check in at home. And when I checked in at home, I found that the draft board, the local draft board, had sent me my papers that my friends and neighbors were sending me greetings. So Uncle Sam took me and got me into the military, which for a drunk is exactly the best place to be, because see, there's no drinking age on post. I could drink anytime I wanted to. They sent me to Fort Polk, Louisiana, where I went through basic training. Then I went through medical training, and they sent me to Southeast Asia. I spent a couple of years in Southeast Asia, and in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, we got beer occasionally, but we got to go back into the rear area and relax and recover, as they call it. And on those occasions, they'd have these great meals for us, but I wasn't interested in the food, I was interested in the alcohol. And drugs are very prevalent in the military, especially in a combat situation like that. So I used more, drank less. I finally got out of the military and came home. When I came home to a world that didn't want us. Vietnam veterans were not welcome at home. Vietnam veterans were treated pretty badly. So I took my uniforms, my medals, and everything and shoved them away and found the local bar. I drank probably solid for 6 months. At the end of that 6 months, I felt that I should be in the ministry. I don't know that I was ever called to the ministry, and I don't know that I wasn't called to the ministry. What I know is that that's what I wanted to do. So I went to Bible school and I went to seminary. I became an ordained full gospel minister, and I was in the business of religion. All I did was do the footwork, as we call it in the program, but basically what I did was I showed up at work just like a doctor, a lawyer, any professional person. I showed up at work in the morning, I went home at night. And at night I sat in my living room and got drunk again. And felt less than again. And felt I didn't belong. There came a point in all of this when I decided that, God didn't care about me anyway, and I'd done so much against him that it didn't make any difference at this point. I mean, God wasn't looking out for me, and I was just doing the business, as I said. And I kind of fell away from it and got away from it because, see, you can't be a drunk and a minister in the full gospel church. It just doesn't seem to work out that way. People tend to call you in the middle of the night when they have a problem. And if you're drunk, you can't go be of service to these people. And so I sort of drifted away from that and drifted into every kind of odd job you can think of. I went back to school and got my degree in psychology because I decided that I'd be a good psychologist. And all the time, every night, was another drunk. I like what somebody told me once, and I believe it's true for me. I never wanted a drink in my life. What I wanted was a drunk. I wanted the pain, I wanted the shame, I wanted it all to go away. And it wouldn't go away. It wouldn't go away. It just became more painful and more painful. I finally came to a point in the business of church that I was elevated to an overseer, which is a bishop type, an auxiliary bishop basically, because they couldn't leave me in a church anymore, but they didn't want to get rid of me either. See, the church doesn't know what to do with an alcoholic because the church doesn't understand an alcoholic. Only an alcoholic understands an alcoholic. And the church tried, and they tried very hard to help me, but I wasn't willing to be helped. What I wanted was to be drunk. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to feel good. And none of that was happening for me. I walked away from the ministry and moved on to other jobs. I became a paramedic because I felt like being a paramedic was going to be something I could do to help people. And by helping people, I could get back and be in God's good graces. But see, I didn't believe God wanted me back. I didn't believe that God would ever take me back because of the kind of person I had been, because of the person that I wanted to be didn't exist, and I kept trying to be that person, and I didn't fit. Becoming a paramedic helped a little bit, but again, you can't drink and use and be a paramedic, because there comes a point where you're called to go to work, and you can't go to work because you've been too drunk. During the time I was being a paramedic, and during the time I was working around, I discovered that hospitals were a nice place to work. So I went to work in emergency rooms and hospitals, and I tried real hard to be real good at it, and I am very good at it. I went from there into becoming a physical therapist because that was even better, and there was no blood and there was no trauma. It was after the fact. I was working at a hospital in the San Fernando Valley, and I was getting drunk. I was coming out of the back door of the hospital into the back door of the bar every single night and driving home drunk over Santa Susana Pass. I would drive over these mountain roads, these twisty mountain roads, and sometimes I would get home and not know how I got there when I woke up the next morning. I can remember getting up in the morning and going out and looking at the car to make sure there wasn't something or somebody stuck to the front of it. I remember the fear I felt when I got up and didn't know where I was. At some point along the line, I decided that I was no longer of any value to myself. I knew I was of no value to God, and I knew I was of no value to my fellow human beings. I decided that life wasn't worth living for me anymore. I remember calling a pastor on the phone and not telling him who I was or where I was, and telling him all about all the things I'd done wrong, and him telling me that God didn't care that I did all that. He still loved me, and that isn't what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that I was all right, and I wasn't all right. In my head, I wasn't all right. In my life, I wasn't all right. In my connection with God, I wasn't all right. And I decided that the only thing I could do to please God and myself was to take me out of this world. It took me a long time and a lot of planning, and what I did was I went and got a gun. I happened to be what they call a gun nut. I know all there is to know about a lot of firearms. And I picked the one that I knew would do the most damage. It's a 9mm Browning automatic that I put to my head, knowing full well that if I squeezed that trigger just right, I might get 2 rounds off, because I didn't want to be a vegetable. I'd worked in emergency rooms and I'd seen people who messed up suicide and were vegetables, and I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be a burden anymore. So I put the clip in the gun, I cocked around into the chamber, I put the gun up to my head, and I pulled the trigger. And it clicked. It didn't go off. I didn't die. And I felt like I had failed at one more thing. I couldn't live, and I couldn't die.
They say don't quit before the miracle. Skip was about to find a program that would change his life. But before all the good news was to take place, there was a price to pay. Life on life's terms. Losing a son to an automobile accident was the ultimate test for Skip. And by the grace of God, there wasn't even the thought of a drink.
I drove into the parking lot, and I can remember the feeling in my stomach. I wanted to run, but I couldn't because I had someone with me. Not only did I have my wife with me to go to an Al-Anon meeting, I had my kids with me, and they were going to go to an Al-Teen meeting. And God put a AA meeting between the parking lot and the Al-Anon meeting. And I walked in the door of that AA meeting, and there sat somebody that I drank with years before. And that somebody looked up at me and said, "Hey, Skip, it's about time you got here." My wife went to the Al-Anon meeting. My kids went to the Al-Teen meeting, and I stayed at an AA meeting. That was 18 years ago, and I haven't found it necessary to drink or use since that day. Alcoholics Anonymous gave me back 2 important things. First, it gave me back my own life. It gave me a sense of belonging. It gave me a sense of being someone who mattered to someone else. Alcoholics Anonymous also gave me something else. It gave me a God I could believe in. It gave me a God who wasn't out to get me, who wasn't out to punish me, but who was really there for me if I wanted him to be. The hands of AA members outstretched in welcome was something I'd never experienced ever before. Not because it didn't exist, but because I couldn't see it. I sat down in that very first meeting and I listened to people share. Ironically, someone took a birthday cake. In Alcoholics Anonymous, we give a birthday cake for 365 days of continuous sobriety. And this person was taking a cake for 7 years of sobriety. And I can remember the thought in my head. The thought in my head was, they have to be lying. They can't be telling the truth. Nobody can stay sober for 7 years. I know now that that's true. You can stay sober for 7 years. And I remember what that person said when they took the cake and somebody asked them, how did you do it? And they said they did it one day at a time. And there was a concept that I could grab onto. There was something I could do. I could stay sober today. I didn't have to be drunk today. And they told me I didn't have to worry about tomorrow. I didn't have to even think about tomorrow as far as drinking was concerned. All I had to do was not drink today, and that I knew I could do, and that I did. I stayed sober one day at a time. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something that was comfortable for me, but I did it. About 4 years ago, in my sobriety, my son was killed in a traffic accident. My son was coming up within days of 90 days of sobriety. And I remember the day that phone rang and his mother called to tell me that he had died in this accident. My first thought was not a drink. My first thought was not a drug. My first thought was to pick that phone up and call somebody. And I did. I picked that phone up and I called my sponsor. And my sponsor came running. From Ojai to Simi Valley, he came running to make sure I was okay. And for the next 5 or 6 days, every time I turned around, there was another member of Alcoholics Anonymous standing there with me, getting me through what I needed to get through, getting me through the funeral and getting me through the hard, heartbreaking time of my son's death. The death of a child is the kind of pain that I pray God no one ever goes through. But it's the kind of pain that I went through sober. I didn't have to drink because my son was dead. I didn't have to drink because I stood and looked into a hole as they put the coffin into it. I didn't have to drink over any of that because there was somebody there with me. My sponsor, my real friends, because you see, today in Alcoholics Anonymous, I know what a friend is. I know what friendship means. I didn't know that before. It never mattered to me before. The only thing I cared about was where my next drink came from. But because of Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm sober today. And sober to me is not just a lack of drugs or a lack of alcohol or the abstinence of it. To me, today, sobriety is a way of life. It's one day at a time. It's a connection with a higher power as I understand that higher power.
Unless a grain falls to the earth and dies, it can never become many, only one. And all the rainfall and the sunny skies could not bring to life the sowing not begun. I would die a little, I would die a little to myself, to bring to you a gift you could not buy. Would you die a little? Would you die a little bit for me? And in dying, would we rise again to life? And so our love goes, it will live or die. We will seek our own or seek each other's good. But when the tears fall and the well runs dry, will the sacrifice of love be understood? I would die a little, I would die a little to myself, to bring to you a gift you could not buy. I would die a little to myself to bring to you a gift you could not buy. Would you die a little? Would you die a little bit for me? And in dying, would we rise again to love? In dying, would we rise again to love? Unless it rained falls, unless it rained falls, unless it rained falls, unless it rained falls, unless it rained my life down for you, unless it rained falls, would you lay your life down for me? Unless it rained falls, unless I lay my life down for you, unless it rained falls, would you lay your life down for me? Unless it rained falls, unless I lay my life down.
You've been listening to The Bottom Line, featuring Skip Story. The Bottom Line is heard coast to coast and around the world on Armed Forces Radio. Until next time, I'm Gary Thiemann. God bless you, and share the message, won't you? This has been a GRT production.